Thank you. I'm going to not go behind the lectern because I think then you may not see me. And I promise you these are only my notes. There's no cricket scores showing on my screen. How many of you have thought about but not purchased an electric vehicle? Out of those folks who have not purchased that electric vehicle, how many of you have not purchased it because we don't have sufficient public charging infrastructure? So only a handful of hands. So I think that is the first contention that I have, that lack of public charging infrastructure is not the bottleneck holding back electric vehicles in India. So I'm not going to use PowerPoint. Much of what I'm going to say is in papers. As a scholar, our institute, Brookings India, these are publicly available reports or op-eds or studies. But a few points I wanted to make, coming more to the grid side than the battery side. We've heard a lot about the battery side, a little about the charging infrastructure, but I want to now try it back to the grid as well. So one of the things we'll get to in a second is, can the grid handle the electric vehicles? Before that, let's first ask about the charging infrastructure. Now, much of the vehicles in India in the short medium run are going to be two-wheelers, three-wheelers, or fleets. By fleets we mean public transport. That's where FAME 2 has a lot of emphasis. Or it may include, not to pick on them, the Ola Ubers of the world, or Gati, or people with dedicated transport requirements like tech companies that do employee transfers to Gurgaon or Pune or different places. Now, these users, the latter, the fleets or public transport, can take care of their own charging infrastructure. They don't need a public charging infrastructure except maybe for emergencies. Two-wheelers, three-wheelers won't need that same level of investment that at one side the government is asking for to create X lakhs or whatever number of public charging infrastructure for four-wheelers, which may not be needed, because the two-wheelers, what's the size of a two-wheeler lithium-ion battery that people are talking about? Anyone? The size of a, how much? Couple of kilowatt hours. 1, 2, whatever, maybe bigger, little more. A home slow charger can give you just under 3 kilowatts of charging speed. That's AC, simple socket, no concerns about who's billing it. Do I tap into a street lamp-based charging infra, which European countries have been building roadside and so forth. So even that problem is solved. So this is my sort of experience or belief structure, which is the lack of a public charging infrastructure isn't what's holding back many buyers, especially from the four-wheeler segment. Second question that this leads to is then, what is going to power or fuel this electricity? Now, it's a whole separate debate that turns religious. Is swapping the solution to public to vehicles? And there are pros and cons. My analysis, as well as some other folks say, it can work for selected fleets, it can work for niches, but for the lay person, it doesn't necessarily make as much sense. And so, if you're not swapping it, you're going to be charging it when? When it's not being used. Now, fleets by definition are often going to be mobile during the day. That's their job. So when do they charge? Overnight, which makes sense. It also makes sense for home users, because if I charge overnight, I can do slow speed charging, medium speed charging. Even AC 3-phase can give you 9.6 kilowatts if you were to go down that route. But I don't see too many home users putting a 50 kilowatt charging system. I'm ignoring the elite, the Tesla drivers, or a few who may put in proprietary or high speed. So if I've got 3 to 9, making up the numbers, kilowatts of charging, regardless of whether it's AC or DC, which is an economics question, that's going to be ideally done in an overnight manner. And so now here's my next question to you. What is the solar output overnight? 0. And so what is India's swing producer of electricity? Coal. Renewables by definition are never swing producers, they're use it or lose it. Hydro is easy to turn on and off, but it's monsoon dependent, and so its duty cycle is not based on marginal demand, but based on other considerations of grid and availability, which includes seasonality. We don't have so much gas, which is in vogue in the US and parts of Europe. It boils down to coal, both as a marginal producer as well as an overnight producer. And unfortunately, coal's carbon impact is vastly worse than liquid fuel. Forget liquid fuel run in a hybrid electric mode, which is actually well-to-wheel exceedingly efficient. And so carbon isn't a good enough driver in the short run until we can grow our renewables dramatically and have it available overnight, which is then going to be heavily wind-based or some other sources. Or double battery. Now think about that. Think about the material science, resource implications, or economic implications that if you want a double battery, either to charge the solar and the solar to your car through the battery, or swapping. Both of these can be done. Are they the lowest hanging fruit that we need to worry about? Probably not. So the last thing I wanted to sort of throw out there from the grid perspective was, can our grid handle this much EV demand? So like many things, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is, on an energy basis, kilowatt hours, it's eminently handleable. A paper a colleague and I have on EVs says that if you do duty cycle extrapolations for 2030 and assume all 2, 3, 4-wheelers and intra-city buses become electric, sale by 2030, which means there'll be some growth between now and 2030 such that sales by 2030 are shift to pure electric. It does not cover all freight. It does not cover intercity buses, for argument's sake. The electricity kWh energy requirement is only in the order of 100 terawatt hours or 100 billion units. Not small, not trivial, but by that time of the electricity grid, it's expected to be only in the order of 4% of your total electricity demand. Measurable, but not impossible, not by any stretch. Now here's the bad news. When you plug in your electric vehicle is probably the most important challenge for the grid going forward, combined followed with where you plug it in, because it's a local congestion issue. 4% is very easy. If all of that's concentrated in select neighborhoods in select cities, then that's a very big problem. But on the time of day aspect, as a thought exercise, we bounded. If you took your duty cycle of charging for vehicle kilometers, so your vehicle is meant to last you whatever 100, 200, or 300 kilometers range, and you spread out your charging such that regardless of the speed, you spread it out across all the vehicles that have to be charged. That's the lowest level of continuous grid demand that you could create. And on the other extreme, you have a hypothetical world where every single vehicle, electric, plugs in at the same time, worst case scenario, Friday evening, because that's really one of the grid super peaks. The spread between best case and worst case in terms of energy, instantaneous capacity requirements is 80x, 80 times. Your grid will collapse. The good news is, of course, we're not going to all charge our vehicles at the exact same time, and the reality is going to fit somewhere in between. Where in between is one of those million, billion, or maybe trillion rupee questions. Because whether you have time of day pricing, whether you have signaling, whether you have incentives, or hard and fast control, supply availability or constraints, that will determine when you charge, how much you charge, is going to be one of the very interesting things going forward. So in the short run, I think worries about the grid are second order. Good, affordable, viable vehicle choices is, I think, one of the key needs that consumers have expressed. It's been publicly stated, I'm not singling out any company, but the two-wheelers that came as electric some time ago were purposely meant to be affordable, the cheap mantra. But to make it so, they actually were underpowered, underranged, and that gave a very bad name to these electric vehicles. So now the good news is we're rectifying it. We're going to get a lot more choices probably within the next 18 months or so. Huge number of vehicle choices across 2, 3, and 4-wheelers. It's still going to be a very small base from which we're going to see a high growth rate, and our grid is, good news, not our bottleneck for the next several years at the least. But that doesn't mean we don't start thinking about this problem, because infrastructure build is a decadal problem. It's not an overnight. We have I don't remember the exact number, 1.5 lakh petrol pumps across India, plus or minus. The government is trying to double it. Now, if I take away a lot of diesel users, the trucks, no one's talking about big trucks going to electric vehicles as the first order. And now, I take away the overnight vehicles, the two-wheelers that will do overnight home charging or a small swap, and I take away the fleets that don't need to go to these because they're supposed to take care of themselves at some home depot, at their own depots. I don't need as much public charging infrastructure as some people are spending public resources on. My challenge for public resources is not what does it cost or where's your payback, but who's paying and who's the beneficiary. The worst sort of public policy, in my opinion, is when we subsidize the rich. So let's be wary of that, and that's why I really like the FAME 2 sort of a design, which focuses on public transport as one of the main beneficiaries of this. So I think there's a lot of movement going to happen in this space. Happy to chat about these more if we have time, or you can see some of our publications on this at our Brookings website. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we directly continue with Mr. Nishan Saini.
At some home depot, at their own depots. I don't need as much public charging infrastructure as some people are spending public resources on. My challenge for public resources is not what does it cost or where's your payback, but who's paying and who's the beneficiary. The worst sort of public policy, in my opinion, is when we subsidize the rich. So let's be wary of that, and that's why I really like the FAME 2 sort of a design, which focuses on public transport as one of the main beneficiaries of this. So I think there's a lot of movement going to happen in this space. Happy to chat about these more if we have time, or you can see some of our publications on this at our Brookings website. Thank you.